So what we're going to do now is talk about the concept of progressive refinement as it relates to this plugin. And it starts off by acknowledging that this is really the most complicated plugin I've written. It has literally hundreds of options that you can choose from. And rather than exposing all of those options as soon as you go to the options menu, I only expose those options that you're actually interested in. And so if we go over to the dashboard, and just for grins, I'm using WordPress 3.3 here. So that's why this navigation menu looks a little different. If we go to the dashboard though, and go take a look at the nav menu plugin. The way this works is that, as you may recall from an earlier lesson, that we have 5 different types of menu elements. We have the overall menu, the typical menu item, we have atypical menu items like the first menu, the last menu, or each menu. We have the submenu items, and then we have the nav menu text styling. And so those are the 5 different types of items that we have. And each of those items has its own set of options. So the way this works is that before you can see all of those options, you have to determine which set of options you want to actually use. And so, for example, under overall menu styles, overall menu customization options, if you expand that, here are the broad categories of options available to you for styling the overall menu. And that's the height and the width, the margin, the padding, background, background color, background image, background gradient, overall menu border, drop shadow, and rounded corners. And if you select any of these, those options show up. So for example, if you show up rounded corners and drop shadow and hit save, now you have the settings for the drop shadow and the rounded corners. And you didn't have these settings before. You didn't have the option of setting these settings before. So if we say 5, 5, and a light gray, just for grins for a moment, and hit save. Now we have configured those options. We've got overall menu background color, a drop shadow, and rounded corners. And if we, let's see, refresh that, now you can see there's our drop shadow and our rounded corners. And stuff happens because we scoped it. We said that we wanted to configure drop shadows, and we wanted to configure rounded corners. And if we hadn't checked those options don't show up below. The only thing that shows up is the things we've selected. That's also true for, say, typical menu items. Again, you can decide that you want to set height and width, or margin, or padding, or background, or border. And you can also decide whether or not you want to set specific menu items to be a specific way. Same thing is true under submenus. You can change the width or the margin or the padding or the background. And what happens also is that some of these options have further options under them. So for example, under the typical menu item style, if you picked typical item background and hit save, now what happens is it shows you the link background style, the hover background style, the current background style, and the current parent background style. And if you open up one of those, you've got a new set of options, whether you want to customize the background color, or use a background image, or use a background gradient for each of these different link states. And so that's what I mean by progressive refinement. You make some high-level decisions, and those high-level decisions hide decisions that are irrelevant and expose you to another level of decisions that are relevant to the decisions you made already. And so if you don't check that section on typical item background, then you aren't going to be asked whether or not you want to specify a background color or a background image or gradient for the menu items. And so that's the way this plugin works. And in fact, the way that all of the more complicated versions of my plugins work is that you have this option to select your options, and once you've selected those options, then those options are visible, and they may themselves provide you with additional options to choose from. So from now on, we're going to be working assuming that you understand that concept.